Israel's offensive in Gaza has ignited passionate protests all around the world, but it's also triggered a backlash against Muslims with a spike in cases of discrimination and hate speech. Are the events in Gaza being used to justify Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian sentiment? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, the British government has so far failed to adopt an official definition of Islamophobia. But since the conflict in Gaza began, attacks on Muslim people and places of worship appear to be on the rise. The Muslim Council of Britain says there has been a 140% increase in Islamophobic offences in London alone.
The bombardment of Gaza has brought tens of thousands out on the streets across the world in solidarity with people in Palestine. But it has also apparently unleashed a new wave of anti-Muslim sentiment in countries and cities far from the fighting. In October, 6-year-old Palestinian boy Wadi al-Fayumi was stabbed to death at his Illinois home by the landlord who targeted the family because they were Muslim.
We're going to put big signs here that say this guy believes in Hamas.
In November, former State Department official Stuart Seldowitz was charged with racial harassment and stalking as a hate crime after levelling abusive comments at a Muslim street vendor in Manhattan. Seldowitz had been targeting the vendor for 2 weeks before police took action. Also in the same month, 3 Palestinian college students were shot in Vermont, leaving one of them, Hisham Awatani, paralysed from the chest down. In the UK, incidents of Islamophobia have also been on the rise. According to the Muslim Council of Britain, there has been a surge of hate crime over the course of bombing in Gaza, with a 140% increase in London alone. The East London Mosque, one of the largest in the UK, had to be evacuated in December because of what was described as a credible bomb threat. In the UK, the reporting of hate crime is complicated by the fact that there is no official definition of Islamophobia. The UK government dropped plans to agree this last year. In 2019, the all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims proposed the following definition. Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. Many in the Muslim community across the UK, Europe and the US feel targeted and unsafe, raising the question, should governments be doing more to protect Muslim citizens?
Well, let's meet our guests. Anas Altikriti, the CEO and founder of the Cordoba Foundation. That's a UK-based group which works to bridge the gap of understanding between the Muslim world and the West. In Chicago, in the United States, Maggie Slavin, Operations Director at the Council on American Islamic Relations. That's a Muslim civil rights and advocacy group. Anas Mustapha is Head of Public Advocacy at CAIR, the organisation which advocates for the due process and the rule of law and an end to the injustices of the war on terror. And here with me in the studio, Massoud Shadjareh is the founder and chairman of the Islamic Human Rights Commission based in London. Anas Altikriti, I speak to you as a Roman Catholic from Ireland, and to my knowledge, I've never been discriminated against because of my religion. I'm guessing the experience of you and many millions of Muslims around the world is very, very different to mine.
Unfortunately, it is, I have to say, and that's for a number of reasons. But before going into the reasons, I think it's important to note that, unfortunately, Islamophobia is not just your run-of-the-mill form of racism, which many societies have anyway. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is that the Islamophobia, or anti-Muslim hatred, if you wish, has become sort of systematic. It's become institutionalized. It's now something that you don't just hear from the bloke on the corner of the road loitering, for instance. It's not just something you hear from an ignorant neighbor or from a shopkeeper who wouldn't know, east from west. It's actually coming from politicians. It's coming from those who are called intellectuals, from those who ought to know better. In fact, they do know better. The problem is that Islamophobia today has become tied with the kind of politics, if you wish, of the world today. And therefore, being a Muslim, I have to say, in many, many parts of the world today is a huge, huge challenge. And you have to bear in mind that, for instance, a person like myself, a person like Anas Mustapha, a person like Massoud Shadjareh could be mistaken for non-Muslims. However, my wife, my mother, my daughter, my aunt, through their wearing of hijab, are absolutely clear that they are Muslims, and therefore the very first line of attack as well as defense against Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred are women.
Maggie, I want to ask you about what's been happening in the United States over the last 2 months. We have seen some terrible attacks on Muslim people living in the US, all since Israel's war on Gaza. Tell us how difficult it has been for the Muslim population of the USA.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up that question. It's been an incredibly difficult 2 months or so for Muslims living in the United States, particularly in the Chicago and Illinois area. So Illinois is home to the largest Muslim population per capita in the United States. And our community members have been facing just skyrocketing instances of hate crimes, instances of discrimination. And it's been an incredibly painful time for us with the tragic murder of Wadia Al-Fayumi, who folks might have heard of, the 6-year-old who was murdered by his landlord. And as the operations director for CAIR-Chicago, on the logistical end, I can just tell you there's been a 700% increase in instances since October 7th. And that includes cases such as a man who was attacked with a knife in his car, and the person was saying derogatory things about Muslims. There are 2 visibly Muslim hijabi women who were stalked in a Walmart, which is like a shopping, like a grocery store, who were shopping and were accused of stealing. And the manager said something about them being Muslim and why they were stealing. And then another woman, just the other day, a woman called saying that she was egged outside of a store when she was just doing her shopping. So I think it's an incredibly difficult time for American Muslims, even to just go outside and do normal things.
Anas, Mustapha, how much does it hurt when you turn on the news, you read newspapers, you go online, and you see appalling crimes being committed against fellow Muslims for no reason other than your religion?
I mean, it's incredibly painful, it's incredibly frustrating, but it's something that we've come to live with, unfortunately. It's become part and parcel of modern life here in the UK and broadly in the West. And in particular now with the onslaught and the genocide that we're witnessing in Gaza, with Palestinians being dehumanized, and much of the narrative around Gaza, around the Palestinians, is a very Islamophobic narrative, a very anti-Arab, anti-Muslim narrative. We're seeing that play out in schools, on the streets. We're seeing that in the behaviors exhibited by the police, by the Home Office, and even 10 Downing Street. And this trickles down, whereby kids are being, bullied at school. They're being bullied by their own teachers. They're being, they can't even express themselves freely. And that's lumbered on top of the kind of Islamophobia and discrimination that already, exists. The government has a number of schemes and programs in place that have been recorded to routinely discriminate against Muslims. And now, with the added focus on Gaza and the clamping down on anything that's remotely pro-Palestine in public spaces, and especially in schools and universities across the UK, we're seeing that just skyrocket. I mean, for example, we handle dozens of cases a week. Right now, since the onslaught on Gaza has begun, we're dealing with nearly 200 cases of people as young as the age of 7 who faced consequences for simply just being pro-Palestinian and being Muslim.
Massoud, your experience of living in the United Kingdom, you've been here 5 decades, you were telling me earlier. Is this country Islamophobic, would you say, or is it a minority?
No, it goes far beyond that. I mean, the reality is, in a report which we did in 2007, we talked about environment of hate. Environment of hate has been created by politicians, by media, day in, day out. And this environment is the cause of ordinary people behaving so badly. We had an example a few years ago of someone in the underground in London kicked a pregnant Muslim woman in the stomach. And when he was taken to court, he said he was ashamed looking at how he behaved in front of his friend, in front of his Muslim friend. So what we are saying is that environment has been created that ordinary people behave abnormal. You know, this environment was also created at the time of Nazis. This same environment was created at the former Yugoslavia, which led to Bosnia ethnic cleansing. And if we don't deal with it now, we're definitely going to sleepwalk into genocide, ethnic cleansing, and much bigger problem. What is really shocking is that politicians and media, instead of challenging this, they are actually party to creating this environment. And unless we tackle that, we are not going to be able to deal with this. And I think the warning I like to give is that if this goes on further, it's not going to just affect the Muslims. We saw at the time of Nazis and in former Yugoslavia, the whole society was a losers. So we need to convince the whole society to change course.
Do you think part of the problem in the UK is there's no legal definition of what Islamophobia actually is?
Well, there is not 100% accurate definition, but there are definitions. I don't think it's the problem of definition. It's the problem of political will to address this. There are more Islamophobes than there are Muslims. So politically, you know, if someone becomes to become popular, then, you know, the easiest way is to behave Islamophobically.
Anas Altikriti, I want to talk about what's going on in the Netherlands at the moment. We've got a politician there, Geert Wilders, who is famously anti-Islam. He has said previously he wants to ban mosques, he wants to ban the Quran, and he's anti-migrant. And this guy just won the Dutch elections. How do you think the Muslim population of the Netherlands are feeling now?
I wouldn't like to be in their shoes, to be perfectly honest. Being a Muslim woman, a mother, a parent, a neighbor, or the such, in Holland right now with the prospect of someone as despicable. Let's not make any excuses for him or for his policies. He was famously once banned from entering this country because he was seen as being someone who wasn't conducive to public interest or public good. To have some, and by the way, the Netherlands is symptomatic of a problem, and I'd like to point this out. Islamophobia is not a problem that pertains to Muslims per se. Islamophobia is generated because of conditions that are either made by political context or by media narratives. Those are the kinds of climates of fear, unfortunately, that Western societies are being engineered or somewhat egged into. So people aren't naturally racist. They don't wake up one day hating Muslims. However, they read headline after headline, they see image after fabricated image, and they get that kind of standoff feeling. The Islamophobia and any other form of hate and discrimination is a problem that all of society, and particularly those who should know better, i.e. the media, intellectuals, and politicians, should know better, and it is a problem that they have to resolve. It's not something that either Muslims need to look at themselves and find ways of resolving. That's the worst kind of attitude, blaming the victim and asking them to come up with reasons. Why is it that people are intimidated by you or hate you or think of you this or that? It's how we resolve this as a society, and we need to look at those at the top, at authorities, and how they behave and how they speak and how they then create the climates that we have right now.
Maggie, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, to my view of this, looks to have modelled himself on Donald Trump. 2024, we could see Trump coming back. He could likely to be your next president. How do you think the Muslim population in the United States will be feeling about Trump 2.0?
You know, I think that politically speaking, Muslims in America are in a very tricky spot right now. Right on the one hand, we're seeing, rightful disgruntlement with Joe Biden. But on the other hand, you also have Donald Trump, who banned Muslims from this country in 2017. So right now, there's no clear option for many Muslims. And this is a conversation we're having in my household. My husband is Muslim, and it's a conversation our community is having, to where there's no good option. So many American Muslims feel disengaged from politics. And while I don't think that anybody is out here like rallying behind Trump, I also don't think anybody's out here rallying behind Biden either. In fact, I'm not sure if you saw, but Michigan, actually, Muslims in Michigan have organized around and said that they're not going to vote for Joe Biden in 2024. So Joe Biden is losing the American Muslim vote literally day after day after day, that there's not a ceasefire. And I think that thank you for bringing up this point, because it's very important, because American Muslims don't have a good option on either side right now. We don't feel like we have allies in our government. In fact, we feel like it's actually a pretty big betrayal.
Anas, Mustapha, how much importance comes from the spoken word that we hear from our political leaders? I mean, this kind of rhetoric, whether it be Geert Wilders in the Netherlands or Donald Trump in the States, it almost empowers the man and the woman on the street, doesn't it? If they hear Islamophobic remarks coming from a politician, the guy on the bus, the guy on the tube, the guy in the street, they almost feel that they can say these things to people.
Certainly, of course, it empowers individuals who already have a prejudice towards or against Muslims to act on that prejudice and sometimes act quite violently and sometimes even fatally. We've always described Islamophobia as being top-down. It trickles down. We need to understand Islamophobia as a sort of cultural phenomenon. Too often politicians want to restrict it to simply acts of violence on the street, and therefore you can have a sort of policing approach to Islamophobia, whilst in contrast to it, when we talk about issues like anti-Semitism, for example, it's understood in the most fullest sense of sort of cultural and also incorporating the violence that people experience. So there is a capacity for politicians to appreciate discrimination that minorities go through in the fullest sense possible, but they refuse to do so because of political persuasions or because of the prejudice that they may have against those said minorities. So when we see statements being made against those going out to protest for Palestine and against the genocide being described as hate marches and being described as a sort of compilation of pro-Hamas Islamists and these kind of radical lefties, then you see scenes that you saw on the Cenotaph on the 11th of November when far-right kind of protesters descended on central London and were very violent even with the police, and they were empowered simply because the Home Office literally called them out to the streets to defend Great Britain from these hordes of Islamists that have a human conscience and that are defending the Palestinian cause. So this is a real life example that we've seen in recent days, and we see it play out every day on the news screens, in the media, and the headlines. The consequences of such narratives being allowed to flourish and to be pushed out without consequence, without punishment, without any penalty.
And as you mentioned anti-Semitism, I noticed the other week the UK Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has pledged £7 million to tackle anti-Semitism. At some point, do you think the UK government will start taking Islamophobia as seriously?
I think the political will isn't really there. The political will to tackle Islamophobia in equally serious terms doesn't really exist. And there have been mechanisms to allow mosques, for example, to apply for funding for security, but there have been some question marks around the transparency of these funds, and there have been other attempts to fund other organizations, but the government then also utilizes this to fund particular organizations that are undermining the broader challenge against Islamophobia, the kind of cultural phenomenon that exists beyond the street level violence. So even when the government is funding or funneling cash into anti-Islamophobia, let's say, it's doing so with nefarious agenda behind it.
Massoud, that's a very good point, isn't it? What Anas has just said, that the political will to tackle this isn't there.
No, it is. I mean, look, you just asked the question regarding funds. The last time I checked, annually 24 million is made available to fight anti-Semitism. And
how much is made available to tackle Islamophobia?
What I remember, the last figure was 5 million for all other religions.
Okay.
So 5 million for Muslims, for the Sikhs,
Hindus,
for
Christians.
Hindus, for Christians, I mean, it's pathetic. I mean, really, you can't justify this. No sane person could actually justify such a thing, except saying at the heart of it, there is prejudice. At the heart of it, there is a concept that some people are more equal than others. And unfortunately, that goes right the way through. We've got Islamophobia playing out. In the same time, we've got the politics of otherization. And this is what is happening in the rest of Europe. Muslims have become the others to blame for everything else. And that's why it becomes very feasible to use the Islamophobic card and actually become popular. And this is what we are seeing, not just in Holland, we've seen it in France, Germany, Britain, United States, and goes on and on. And that is what the heart of the problem is.
Do you think Islamophobia is a vote winner in some places?
Of course it is. Otherwise, these people will not sort of behave in this way. It is the ultimate vote winner. And what is really dangerous is that it starts targeting Muslims, but the legislations and what becomes legitimized then is used against environmental activists and everybody else in the society. So we are losing our civil liberties on the back of Islamophobia, on the back of otherization of Muslims.
And as Altikriti, how sad does that make you feel hearing that Islamophobia has become a vote winner?
Well, it's sad, but it's a reality we have to contend with. And ourselves, myself, the Cordoba Foundation, and countless other Muslim organizations here in the UK, as well as across Europe and in America, Maggie will speak of those, are working tirelessly in order to educate, in order to show the real implications of Islamophobia. And just like Massoud just said, that if we allow Islamophobia to run wild, everyone loses. Everyone with a cause, everyone who is active in a particular sphere loses. And by the way, we talk about Islamophobia, sometimes it manifests itself in very weird ways. I mean, for instance, this anti-migrant or anti-immigration narrative, the government veils it in some sort of trying to protect national interests. But at the very heart of the narrative is you'll find that there are images of women in hijab, or the mention of Syria, or the mention of Iraq, or Libya, or the such, to give the impression that whilst, yes, this is anti-immigration, but actually this is something to counter the arrival of Muslims. So within a political discussion about something that is in the strategic interests of Britain for the next 100 years, all of a sudden you find that Muslims, Islam, are at the very heart of the discussion without them, having said anything or done anything.
And do you think that was deliberately done? Do you think that was deliberately done by Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, that they saw that and they thought they would just inject some Islamophobia into the debate?
It's a rallying call. It's how the right and the far right are brought to the voting table, to the ballot boxes. Boris Johnson often makes big of his grandfather being from Turkish Muslim origin. Yet he knows exactly what he's saying when he uses that particular line about the enormity of the threat of 90 million Turks, as he put it, verging on the UK and turning the UK into a Sharia-compliant country. He knows exactly what he's doing.
Maggie, I want to ask you about what life is like in the United States married to a Muslim man. Paint me a picture of what your friends say to you, Islamophobia that you detect, I don't know, at the school gates or in social circles. Give me a picture of what life is like in Illinois as a woman married to a Muslim man.
Sure, absolutely. Not only am I married to a Muslim man, but I'm also a convert to Islam. So life is difficult right now. I think that people are very afraid. I think that also there's a lot of pressure amongst American Muslims at the moment, especially Muslims who are visibly Muslim, who wear hijab, who wear traditional clothing, to condemn Hamas. We hear this a lot, condemning Hamas. But do you condemn Hamas? And while I understand that, I think it distracts away from the fact that American Muslims feel very targeted, and they feel that that narrative drives the conversation away from what it distracts from the fact that Israel is committing, heinous crimes, war crimes against Palestinians. So I think that there's a disconnect between the broad American public and American Muslims, and that's largely in part. I know that other guests and people on the show have stated that is due to the media, and I would just want to reiterate that, especially in the United States, we have like a cartoonish atmosphere right now for American Muslims, in which they feel, of course, they feel targeted, but also this media machine keeps feeding them.
Maggie, Anas, and Massoud, thank you all so much for your insight. I'm very grateful. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.